Hello, welcome. Welcome to this meeting, OBAG Working Group. I'm David Early with PlaceWorks. You all thought it was the Planning Center DC&E, but as of a week ago, we are PlaceWorks. If you would like to know more about that, I'm happy to tell you later. I am here today with Brad Beck from CCTA and with Walter Kieser from EPS. None of them have changed their names in the last week. And this is a meeting, as you all know, to review two major components today, the draft 2014 PDA strategy update, as well as the PDA planning grant program. We have brief presentations about each of those items, which will be followed by your chance to comment on them. I think you all know that you, as an advisory body, will be commenting, and those comments will be moved forward to the TCC, who will then provide additional comments on those and send those further to the Planning Committee and ultimately the full authority board. Before we start on those two agenda items, I want to do a couple other things. The first of those is that I think it would be great for all of you to reintroduce yourselves, since it's been a while since we've met. And then we also have a time on our agenda for public comment for items that are not on this agenda as required by the Brown Act. So without further ado, I'd like to just go around the circle and let everybody introduce themselves.
Corey Riley, Contra Costa Health Services.
Deidre Heitman-Bart.
Leah Schmidt, City of Pittsburgh.
Hildy Miles, City of El Cerrito, WICTAC.
Carolyn Bookhart with Resources for Community Development.
Shauna Brecky-Reed, Town of Moraga.
Debbie Chamberlain, San Ramon.
Patrick Roach, Contra Costa County Department of Conservation and Development.
Carol Johnson, City of Concord.
Paul Campos with BIA of the Bay Area, and I'd like to take a quick moment to introduce BIA's newest staff member, Ms. Lisa Vorderbergen. So many of you may know her from a previous life, but she's going to be covering East Bay governmental affairs for BIA.
Great. Thank you. All right. Item 2 on our agenda is public comment on any items which are not on our agenda today. Is there any public comment on items not on the agenda? Hearing none, we will go on. The first item of real business, item 3 on the agenda, is the review of the draft 2014 PDA strategy update. I'm going to turn it over to Brad.
Thanks, David, and thank you all for coming today. The PDA investment and growth strategy, you remember it from last year. It's not that funny, I guess, but I'd like to bring up again Resolution 4035, which MTC adopted in 2012 with several revisions throughout the year. And it included Appendix A6, which outlined what the PDA investment and growth strategy is meant to do, and that is to ensure that CMAs, like the authority, have a transportation project priority setting process for OBAG funding that supports and encourages development in the region's PDAs, recognizing the diversity of PDAs will require different strategies. As you can tell, I'm reading directly from the resolution itself. And that language focuses on the OBAG funding, and that was part of the initial PDA growth investment and growth strategy. There is no OBAG funding for the next round yet. We don't know how, if. I'm pretty sure the MTC will change it. We don't know exactly how they will change the OBAG funding priorities, the process, the factors we have to consider, or anything. But we, as CMA, have to update our PDA investment and growth strategy. And one of the things we have to do in the long-term planning objectives outlined in the resolution is to starting in May 2014, and all subsequent updates, PDA investment and growth strategies will assess local jurisdiction efforts in approving sufficient housing for all income levels through the RENA process, which you're all familiar with, and where appropriate, assist local jurisdictions in implementing local policy changes to facilitate achieving these goals. So that has been the focus of this update, is trying to address that, trying to understand what the needs are in the different PDAs, all 37 of them in Contra Costa, and outlining some of the issues that you all, as local staff, have brought up to us when we were trying to update and get this information. The second thing that we're here for is in the next item on the PDA planning grant program, which we'll discuss after this one. But next I'd like to have Walter Kieser to come up and talk a bit about what EPS did to come up with this 2014 update of the PDA strategy.
Thank you, Brad. Again, my name is Walter Kieser. I'm a senior principal with Economic and Planning Systems. Hello, everybody. We basically, over this past period of months, have basically assembled this document to include documenting what was done last year, which some of you participated in, including the OBAG project selection process and also the planning grant program, or at least determining how we would move forward with that program. We also did work necessary just to update the original document and numbers to what has happened meanwhile with the Plan Bay Area. In terms of ongoing efforts, things we started but haven't fully completed yet, consistent with what Brad just said, we're working on two things pursuant to Resolution 4035. One, improving our information about the PDAs in more detail, and also this topic of housing policy. So as some of you know, we've been involved with the process of gathering that information. Candidly, it's gone a little slow, so we haven't gathered all that information yet, and one of the things we'll be doing as a matter of follow-up is getting back in touch and figuring out what we can do to complete that process and get that information finalized here going forward. One of the things that will be a relevant topic to that question is exactly what and how does that information plug into or relate to the investment and growth strategy going forward. That's one thing that MTC did not tell us. So I guess we have the opportunity to determine that ourselves, and something that we might want to talk about today or at some subsequent meeting. We just don't want to collect information for the heck of it, or to disturb you, or to give you extra work to do, but rather there should be some purpose. And so one of the things we should talk about is that, so there is some sense of relevance to that effort. In any case, we will continue doing that. The other thing that we are looking forward to going forward as next steps includes the retention of consultant team panels related to the planning grant program, and then later, after I believe April, we'll be going out for the planning projects. Correct, Brad?
Yes.
Yes. And then also another thing that's ongoing relative to this whole effort is the integration of the investment and growth strategy, PDA strategy, and both the countywide transportation plan, which Brad tells me he's working on, and also Measure J. As you know, from the beginning, we were talking about trying to integrate and leverage these programs so that they're focused on the same set of improvements, and we're doing our very best to direct those things to support PDA investments. So those are some of the things that we'll be working on. So we have a draft of the document that you've been given just very, very recently, and it will be in draft form for another few weeks before we bring it to, another month or so before we bring it to the authority. So during that time, we may be making additions and corrections and that sort of thing, like you would expect in any draft report. So with that, I'll turn it back to David.
Let me give a little follow-up to that. First, the schedule. We're going to take this draft to TCC next week, which is the authority's technical coordinating committee, and they will make some recommendations, and any comments that you make today, we will try to incorporate into the draft and bring your comments to TCC to consider, and then it will go to the planning committee, our planning committee, in the first week of April, and to the authority on whatever the third Wednesday is in April, I've forgotten the date. But what we're hoping that you will tell us today are a couple of things. One, given what we have in the document and what you know, are there any infrastructure needs that you think, any observations you could make on the sorts of things that the authority could help in terms of making investments that would encourage the development of PDAs in Contra Costa? And second, are there things that you know about ABAG and MTC's programs that you think that could be tweaked to better reflect the realities of things in Contra Costa? I think those are the two big concerns that we want to hear about today. So with that,
the air conditioning will go on. Yeah, so I think that we should do this the way reviews like this typically occur. We'll open it up right now for any questions you have, then we'll see if there's any comment from the public, and then we'll take comments from all of you. So are there any questions that you would like to ask at this time? Yeah, Patrick.
I don't know what happened, but the printout, when I printed it out, a lot of tables went blank.
In which parts? All parts? The
Well,
appendices?
in the,
Interesting. What page is that?
let's see here.
18 and 19.
Yeah, 18, 19. There's a couple of tables that are,
I have the same problem.
Oh, mine's the same too.
14, page 14. And it appears that some of the headings were missing too, like subtitles or subheadings.
No, the whole table, Appendix A, those tables are all blank also.
it will be no consolation to you to know that mine is fine.
I have a nice Appendix A, but I have the same problem on page 19 and 20, or 18 and 19, and 20. Yeah, this is...
The one on the table over there also printed out weird, but in a different way.
Should we ask, can we ask Diane or someone to make some more right now, or how should we proceed here?
Yeah.
We will try and get some more copies.
So the pages, the bad pages.
Yeah, maybe you can identify for us which pages we know are bad. 18, 19, and 20.
Page 14.
14, are you keeping track here, Andrew? 14, what do you have?
29.
Hold on, what's on 14, Patrick?
Sorry, 19.
19. So 18, 19, and 20, and then I heard a 29. Yeah, my
Correct.
29s is not so good. And then some of you said your Appendix A is not good?
The tables are blank. The tables are there, but there's no data.
Table 4-1 on page 29.
Right, we got to page 29. So table A1, is that what the table you're saying?
Yeah,
I have a
and-
very nice table A1, but that's
And,
not...
and B1 also. So this is,
All of the,
see,
all of it, I mean,
yeah, pretty much, this is what the appendix.
What about the tables in Appendix D?
Appendix D, every page should have both a graphic and...
Those are all coming up, the little profiles are all fine.
They're okay, all right.
That worked.
Yeah. And then E, the housing element, that looks to be correct.
It got,
Yep.
yeah.
So it was the PDF that was sent to email is what we
But that's still okay.
that's also what
So it sounds like it's just the 18, 19, 20, 29, and Table A, Appendix A,
and B.
and B, okay. So, okay, so that's, we will try and solve that. Thank you.
Proof that we did try to read something.
That's excellent. Do you have any
Absolutely.
questions about pages 1 through 16 or 17 or appendices C or D or E?
Question?
Yes.
I have a comment.
Well, before we do comments, I
oh.
think we should hear from the public. So let's just
Okay, I have a question.
Okay.
Did you update the numbers based on ABAG allocations in 2013?
Yes. Yeah, in fact, as you know, that was a moving target and may still be moving for all we know. And there was not only change, there were almost continual updates that we all were noticing on our base camp site. And so to the best of our ability, we were tracking those to the day that this was published. There still may be some problems. So if you see things that look irregular, let's talk about it and get it straight. But we made the effort to keep up. But as you know, it's a lot of numbers and a lot of jurisdictions, and we were going fast. So yeah, so anything like that, I would suggest that we don't have to use this time. You can just pop us an email and note where you think there might be a problem. Then we can dialogue about it and determine what to do.
So, Walter, those are the numbers when in the profiles for the PDAs where you have the growth projections, you
Yes.
use the latest?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And there were, well, again, this whole interaction, this whole process with ABAG kind of continually tweaking these numbers a little bit was frustrating.
So these aren't the numbers that were in the Plan Bay Area EIR?
These have been, they've been altered a bit. They've changed a little bit. Not a lot, but there are some
So
changes.
can you direct us to where those most recent numbers are?
Excuse me?
They're coming, what's the source of those numbers?
Well, they have, just recently, ABAG published projections 2013. That's the source.
Okay.
And we literally got an early version of this of projection 13 about a month ago, and then between then and now they changed it a little bit. So suffice to say, we're tracking a little bit of a moving target, and we've done our best. But I think hopefully over this next month, in our dialogue with you and others, we can make sure that everything is in fact consistent.
We're still trying to get what the numbers that ABAG settles on. Even the published version of projections 2013 isn't exactly right.
Right.
And they don't have any PDA numbers, and the PDA numbers that are in there have been tweaked a little. So it's been frustrating for all you, I know, and it's been frustrating for us.
I mean, we're going through a specific plan EIR, so we would really like to know those numbers.
Yeah. Well, again, we
Let's talk
can,
to ABAG.
but just let's talk, and we have as good a handle on it as anybody. That is to say, a dialogue with them, and we're aware of the shortcomings. So you're free to call us and ask us a question, and then we can work together to clarify it, and even use our good offices with ABAG to hopefully straighten things out that appear odd. Yeah.
I had a question
Yes.
about the housing element tables. I think they're not filled in. Most of them are blank. Is that a conversation that's ongoing, or did I miss something where you were asking us to fill that in?
Yeah, yes, those data requests are pending, and
Okay.
and we've gotten, candidly, we've gotten some information back from the jurisdictions, but because I didn't get like a full sample, I didn't want to put it, because then that would embarrass people, which I didn't want to do. So
Appreciate that.
So as soon as that information is clarified or close, we will fill in the blank, so to speak.
And should we be directing that sort of information through Brad, through Walter? Okay, thank you.
And you're referring to Appendix E, just to be clear, right? Yeah. Okay. All right, any other questions? All right, are there any questions or comments from the audience on this agenda item?
Sorry, which portion are we asking questions about?
This entire document, except for the planning grants process. Any questions or comments from the audience? Okay, hearing none, we will then come back to the working group for any comments that you may have. Yes, Patrick. Paul, sorry.
P is close enough.
Yeah, the P's. All the men with P are on my right.
Okay. I'll let that one go. First, a couple comments. First, I want to commend Brad and the consultant team and the staff. I think this is outstanding update, and I think the way CCTA has approached this entire process really is a model for all of the CMAs, and I just want to thank you for that. With regard to a couple of specific suggestions, I agree wholeheartedly with the notion of seeking feedback, especially from the local jurisdictions and communities, and going back to ABAG and MTC on potential program changes, and in particular the PDA place types. We've seen post-adoption of Plan Bay Area a lot of PDAs falling like flies in jurisdictions like Marin, where folks just think they're too dense. And I saw that in my own town of Danville, where, you know, good development area opportunities and infill areas are, I think, unfortunately being shut down because of the minimum densities in some of the PDAs. And I think that actually relaxing some of that might have the impact of bringing people and making them more comfortable with becoming a PDA, which is what the region is aiming for. Second, I question whether it's necessary for all the CMAs to expend the staff and financial resources on annually updating these documents. You know, ABAG and MTC are updating the SCS every 4, maybe 8 years, and I think that that might be something to bring back to them. And then finally, on the analysis of PDAs that appears to be ongoing and the tracking, there's one technical issue that I would like to see CCTA track and report back to ABAG and MTC, and that's on one of the financial assumptions that those agencies made. Sort of a blanket financial assumption that was not widely publicized, that the OBAG program, the roughly $15 billion over the course of the planning period, would increase net profit on the development of every PDA unit by $30,000 per unit. It's almost difficult to say for me with a straight face, but that is the assumption that underpins Plan Bay Area, and I'd like to see if there's any actual empirical evidence over the next couple of years in Contra Costa PDAs as to whether these grants that we're going to be handing out have that impact of increasing net profit by $30,000 per unit. Thank you.
Other comments? Yes, Deidre.
You know, I've said this before, and just bear with me. I have been remiss in not getting to you guys. I have half of a letter written, and it's not rocket science, so I have really no excuse. But, you know, developing the PDAs around the BART stations requires a lot of transit infrastructure that has not been identified or really even talked about much. And so I would like somehow to incorporate that into the, you could just, as soon as I get my letter drafted, include it as an appendix or whatever, because the numbers are overwhelming if you look at the BART system. But I think it would be helpful to even talk to bus operators and other transit providers. Specifically, what I've seen in my 13 years at BART is that the cost of structuring the BART parking is just overwhelming and dooms many potential developments, especially in the areas where the rents or the price of the market price of the units are not high enough to support all that infrastructure. So that's all. I will get it to you by Friday. That's
Right.
Can I ask a Deidre? It would be helpful, and that's a fine idea, of course, not having that information we're not able to include, but I think the idea of identifying at least roughly those improvements or issues PDA by PDA would be great if we could just work through that. I mean, we know the PDAs that have BART stations
Well, the way we've identified it, many of the stations need to be expanded and upgraded, and I think we have some range of costs that we can include in that. I know the price per parking space for a BART parking structure. And then there are other things such as system upgrades, new cars, things like that, that I'll just throw in for good measure. But so that's about as close as I can identify it. We recently completed concept plans for the two El Cerrito BART stations to modernize them, and included everything from new bus shelters and furniture to expanding the paid areas and making better connections with the communities. And the cost will blow your mind, but hopefully, so there's a range of costs there that we can look at.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Other comments? Shauna?
I can leave with Walter the comments from Lafayette about how the numbers did change, and so the fact sheet should represent that.
Thank you. Any other comments? Hildy?
I'll just add one. Under the discussion starting on page 13 of the factors affecting development of the PDAs, I really appreciated that discussion of the various constraints, and particularly the inclusion of site-related and context constraints and infrastructure constraints. And what I'm wondering or struggling with, and I know that you put this together, I think you did a great job under a short time frame, is sort of how to get this discussion more robustly developed in sort of the implementation of the document or later iterations of the document. So I feel like we're getting there incrementally.
Yeah, well, that's right. And again, we're talking about a big urban fabric here, and we could spend a lot of time and money in each and every PDA as we have in many of the planning studies. But yes, I think our reasoning for setting forth those constraints is to focus everybody's on the attention that it's not one thing. It's a bunch of things, and those different things are going to have different strategies, number one. And number two, the ability for CCTA to address these is limited to a small subset of all of those things. And so there's a much bigger topic going on here. We're presently working for the Strategic Growth Council right now at the state level, looking into this from the state's perspective to what they could do. I think that's amusing after they took redevelopment away, but such is life. But seriously, we are going to be working, and there are people working at the Strategic Growth Council and in the legislature keying in on this broader topic: regulatory, hazardous remediation issues, redevelopment issues, funding issues, et cetera, et cetera. So I like to view this piece of work as one piece of a bigger puzzle that you all face in doing this, and we would hope that we hope, and I understand that you understand that, and we hope that MTC and ABAG understand that as well. This is a big task that's set before us.
Shauna?
So following up on what both Walter and Hildy said, is it appropriate under factors affecting development of PDAs to include the operational issues? I'm hearing it from Deirdre to a certain extent for BART, and certainly buses are the case as well, that we can have all the infrastructure in the world, but if we can't have the operations, it won't work.
Yes, that's a perfectly good add, something that perhaps we're focused a lot of times on just the dirt, so to speak, and not the BART operations, but it's perfectly right that it's fine to say that you've got transit-oriented places, but if the transit isn't working, it's a problem. So I think that's a good add. So I think we can make some comment about that. Yeah.
Other comments? Okay. Then I think we're ready for item 4 on our agenda. We will follow roughly the same approach. Brad has a presentation. I think Walter makes a few comments then, and we'll take your questions, any comments from the floor. And this is related to the PDA grant program itself, which is the one, I'm saying from memory, it's Appendix C, right? That's what I was about to say. So we're looking particularly at Appendix C now.
Yes. One of the requirements of, well, let me step back one step. MTC, and one of their last decisions on Resolution 4035, took some of their PDA planning money and gave it somewhat under duress to the CMAs to allocate, given that the CMAs have some greater familiarity with the needs within the county. So through that $20 million that was set aside for the CMA, the authority is getting $2.745 million. And we included a PDA outline of the PDA planning grant program in the initial PDA strategy. And what's in Appendix C now is basically the same thing, but we have a somewhat expanded introduction, and we have a discussion of the process at the end, which was suggested to be added by the Contra Costa planning directors at their meeting in January. So let me go through a bit on what the process and some of the details of the program are. The overall process is that we, the authority, are going to contract with a number, we're going to create this list of consultant teams, and they will have the expertise and experience to provide the planning services required to do PDA planning studies. We've just released last Friday an RFQ for those teams, and we should be getting them within the next month and a half. We're going to have a committee of local staff, at least one from each of the 4 subregions in Contra Costa, review those submittals and come up with a recommended list of consultants. That's part 1. Part 2 is after the authority adopts the PDA strategy for 2014, we will release a call for projects to jurisdictions to submit their request for planning studies. And they could be a wide range of planning studies, from market studies to community outreach, environmental review, land use alternatives, urban design standards, all the kinds of studies that you might need to move the development of your PDAs closer into actual implementation. So we would release that and give you, the local staff and jurisdictions, about 2 months to come up with your submittals and submit them, and we would have either the same or a similar committee of local staff and authority staff to review those submittals and come up with a recommended list that we would give to the TCC and to the authority for approval. And then that would happen probably in September. Then we get the actual submittals. Now, we would have a list of consultants when we have planning grants and planning program projects. And we will have, at that point, a negotiation or development of a agreed-upon scope of work between, and we can see the 2 consultants are perking up their ears at this. There'll be a negotiated scope of work between, well, I should say among, the authority, the consultants, and the local staff on what gets done, when, what the schedule is, what the budget is. And that will probably take some time during the fall. And then the authority would hold the contracts. We have 2 planning consultant managers who will help us oversee the contracts and make sure that the projects are moving forward and helping smoothing out any rough rough patches that we might hit on the, not that there would be any, as David said. Hope springs eternal, I always say. So we would have about 3 years to do those. We hope to finish up all those planning grants. So that's the basic process. And we have in the document a list of the kinds of things that you could do. MTC in their program, and they have a call for projects out now for their own PDA planning grant program. They want bigger projects. They want complete projects. We're asking that under our program, you can have a smaller subset. It doesn't have to be the whole shebang and the whole enchilada. It could be just a component that you need a next step to build on what you've done before, or an initial step, or some middle step even. There are some selection criteria. Planning area has to be a planned or potential PDA. Could be a Resolution 34 transit station. I don't think they're different in Contra Costa. Local transit providers have to be supportive or partners with the application. Applicant has to committed minimum local match, and the way that would work is that we would get billed by the consultant, and then once we got their bills, we would bill the jurisdiction. Now, since we're using our money, the Measure J money, to fund the consultant managers, we're going to try to offset some of the match that you would otherwise be required by using their staff time as a part of that local match. We have to figure out the details on that, but that's what we intend to do. And then we need to have some indication of support from your board that you support the planning grant. And then there are 6 different criteria. Location within a community of concern, which is one of MTC's interest. 5 points, up to 5 points for that. Project impact, whether it would increase performance measures within the PDA or remove a key constraint to implementation of your PDA plan. That's up to 25 points, up to 15 points for compatibility of your policies with the development objectives, up to 25 points for planning process, whether your proposal is part of one of these larger or a larger planning effort on the jurisdiction's part. Local readiness and commitment, and finally implementation feasibility. So those were the criteria. Those have not been changed in any substantial way from the initial PDA strategy of a year ago. So that's pretty much the whole thing, and we're looking for your comments.
All right, so following the same format, I think we'll take any questions first, then see if there are any comments from the audience, and then take your comments. Any questions? Yes.
So just to be clear, you don't have to do you can take one of these and do one piece of it. You don't have to include it. Okay.
Any other questions? Yeah, Corey.
A bunch of questions, actually. What is the either requirement or the benefit for having CCTA be the holder of the consultant list and the project list, rather than granting projects to the cities and having them go through their own selection process?
The basic, one of the problems with these funds are that they're federal funds. There's STP, Surface Transportation Program funds, and if we were to grant individual grants to jurisdictions and make you go through the process, it would be hard. Planning studies are easier than capital improvements, but they're not easy. And we thought it would be easier. We thought it would be easier for the jurisdictions if we would take on that administrative burden. every one of you, if they were to be individual grants, every one of you would have to go through that local assistance process, get your own E76. This way, we can get a single E76, which you are in the process of doing, and then we can give out grants. It also means that since you don't have to go through this whole process, we can give out smaller grants for smaller projects. If it's you just want the minimum size is 75,000. MTC's, I think, is 300,000 or 250. So this way we can give out, if you just need a small, say a parking study in your PDA to try to come up with new policies to help development and come up with the best set of standards for parking, we could do that kind of study for you. And that's probably a long-winded answer for it.
One more, go ahead.
I have many more questions, but I mean, I don't know when I
Well, we'll take one more and see if others want to ask anything.
should. Is this beholden to the same criteria that was laid out in 4035? Like there were those 4 or 5 points, and I can't recall what they were now. I know one of them was prioritize communities of concern. I can't remember what the other ones were. Are they beholden to that same criteria list?
No, they're not. We do, MTC is concerned about communities concerned, hence the name. And there's also they're under some direction from the federal government to make sure that under sorry.
It's you.
It's me. You won't hear it now. MTC is under some direction to make sure that funds that they have are benefiting all income levels within the region. Hence, that's the reason why they included that factor within Resolution 4035, and also why they're continuing to include it in the PDA planning grant programs. There's one thing that we will have to add to this, and that's that there is a set of requirements that MTC has for their PDA planning program, and that if you do one of the certain kinds of elements, that you have to follow some of the rules and requirements that they've laid out for their planning grant program in this one as well.
Shauna.
A couple questions. One is that, could you explain what your thinking is behind 1/3 of the available funding being potentially awarded to any one jurisdiction?
That's so that we could, even though it's not necessarily supported by MTC, we wanted to make sure that we could have more jurisdictions get funding, because we do know that there is a need throughout the county. So,
if I can add, although I'm just a facilitator, I don't think this is a statement that we expect a full third to go to someone. It's just a maximum cap saying that there is this upper limit. And of course, you couldn't even get to that third with a single project, because 900,000 isn't a full third of 2.745. So what this is saying, though, is that even if a jurisdiction had 2 really strong applications at 500,000 each, those 2 could not both be funded.
Okay.
But it's not a statement that we expect to give a third to a single jurisdiction.
Okay. And then my next 2 questions are sort of interrelated. In the first paragraph, last sentence, it talks about targeting PDAs that are high impact and capable of early implementation. The entire purpose is planning and positioning PDAs in order to be successful. And then when we look back and forth between the elements of what the grant would be and the evaluation criteria, I would like an explanation about how those 3 things weave in with each other. And if you want me to explain what I mean, I'm happy to.
I'm trying to remember where you said the first paragraph, but which,
So right here.
Page C1.
okay, C1. That's, well, that is from Resolution 4035, and not everything in the resolution is unambiguous. What MTC is, as their executive director has said, is against the idea of spreading the peanut butter. And they are trying, and this is a push nationally as well, is to focus your funding on places that will have the biggest impact. And that's behind the thrust for use of performance measures, which is included in MAP 21, that every state has to have performance measures, that MPOs have to use performance measures and allocate in their funding. So that's what's behind that statement. I'm trying to remember the other points and how that fits with
I didn't.
limiting.
You had a second part of your question, and maybe you could repeat that.
So the planning elements describe, for instance, a market demand analysis or doing a parking analysis. But when one looks at the selection criteria, it requires readiness, demonstrated market readiness, for instance, under 6, or compatibility of policies with development objectives under 3. And I'm wondering how those two things are compatible with each other.
Well, I would say not perhaps perfectly. That is one of the difficulties. We purposely didn't try to do what we did for the OBAG funding, which we were dealing with projects. And with projects, we tried to have as quantitative a set of criteria as we could. These are planning studies, and the criteria are a lot more general, and that's why we're having local planning staff help judge the applications. On the implementation feasibility, you're right that if you haven't done the market study, you won't have the details, but I think that jurisdictions could make a case on the feasibility from the staff's knowledge of the PDA that they're applying for, on what the market has been, the kind of development interest that there might be, and it would be up to the local staff to make the case based on their knowledge. And if it's a market study, then you could say that you need to you need more information on the details, that you have a sense from the interest that's been expressed to the staff. I mean, I'm sort of making a case, giving you a template that you can put into your application, I guess. And then you could use your local information to make the case of why this additional market demand study and the details that would come out of it would be needed.
Back to Corey with other questions. Does anybody else have questions? Well, otherwise, we'll play ping pong between Corey and Shauna.
I have
Hildy.
one question.
Yeah.
I actually have two questions, but Shauna's question of sort of broadly how project impact and how these sort of things layer together. But going back to the RFQ and the sort of stable of consultants that you'll sort of vet to be available, I think one question is how to cast the net broadly enough. So, for example, if I want to do community outreach as part of my grant request, and I'm doing community outreach to communities of concern where there are perhaps language barriers or other issues such that it would be very appropriate to work with a nonprofit group that has that language and that sort of, they're on the ground in that community. But you didn't anticipate that in your stable of consultants. Could they be a sub to one of the consultants? I mean, I'm just sort of, I don't want to sort of preclude certain types of activities based on who's in that stable.
We could, I think we could work that in. There'd have to be a process for doing that, obviously, but I think that the consultant, we've listed all of the activities that are listed in here in the RFQ. I think that we could put something in about adding additional sub-consultants as part of the team. You have to figure out how to do that exactly, but.
No, and I appreciate, I know you have the procurement standards are strict.
Did you have one more question?
Yeah, just so in terms of measuring these different evaluation criteria, so part of it is if feasibility or readiness is a challenge, then it sounds like part of what you would demonstrate is how whatever you're proposing in your grant application is going to sort of help remove that constraint. Your market may not be ready, but here's some things we could do to get ready, right? I'm thinking along those lines. In terms of project impact, so it's increasing the performance measures within the PDA, housing supply, employment, retail, transit ridership, and removing constraints. Some types of studies are not going to have a real clear line in terms of quantifiable, oh, it's going to result in X amount of development. And then there are some things like housing policies, housing mitigation fees, inclusionary housing ordinances that there's political challenges, but there are also economic challenges because, as we know, if you have a marginal economic climate, you may be delaying market rate development by implementing affordable housing policies. There's a tricky thing going on there. So how you want to, in some of your documents and some of the MTC documents actually acknowledge that, but that's a tricky, how you build a case and not shoot yourself in the foot is interesting.
Do you want to comment on that, Brad?
I'm going to have to listen to the tape and figure out how to deal with it. I think, you're right that there is this balance, and that's always a problem with inclusionary housing, or if you have a housing mitigation fee, how when is the fee to...
I think we're struggling with incremental development of our PDAs. So I think there's sort of a question of how do we phase certain things? Different people are thinking differently about how they're going to implement their PDAs, but if you can show that you have a plan for how you're going to build on this and incrementally phase it in, you can't, I think, and maybe there's a broader forum to sort of talk about some of the housing policies, but it's a tricky question.
Hildy, you bring up a very good point, and this conflict, as you describe it, is pervasive. And one of the things, and in my remarks, I made a point about where we have these kind of quote-unquote pervasive problems that you're all facing. One of the things that we might do is to actually get into that and try and analyze that a little bit and figure out how to optimize, if you will, and also what are the obvious constraints. That is to say, the problem with the kind of housing that we're talking about in the PDAs is that even at market rates, sometimes it's not feasible. Throw in affordable housing requirements of one kind that land on the private side, and you've just dug yourself a deeper hole. So that's a pervasive problem. It's a reality. So, well, how do you crack that is the question. And perhaps that's something that we can work on and be thinking about. We certainly are thinking about it ourselves as a part of this work with the state, because it's just a pervasive problem everywhere. And what we'd like to be able to do in that discussion and analysis is to get to a point where we're asking the right questions and not just making stuff up, or wishful thinking, so to speak. And so the problem that you've identified is a very real one, and I think maybe that's something that, as a matter of follow-up, we could be trying to figure out. How do you do that? Yeah.
Yes, Carol.
I just wanted to underscore Hildy's first comment. I saw that from our own experience with our PDA plan and talking to other planners that are going through that process right now. If you don't have a community that's actively engaged, but the involvement of the community is critical for the success of the plan, really we do have to rely on these existing nonprofit organizations that really know the community and the community have that trust established. And so if there's not a way to include them on these projects in some fashion, I think the resulting projects are just not going to be at all successful. So I think we need to figure out how to make that happen.
Patrick.
Hi. This is a question to Brad, and it's more relates to the flow, the management flow of the work. So as I understand it, the stable of consultants, they are under contract to the authority, correct?
Yes.
So the work that they do, is that approved by the authority, or is that approved by the local jurisdiction?
Well, the idea is that we would manage the contract and the local staff would manage the work. So we have our planning managers, we have 2 of them we've contracted with. We figure 1 FTE a year for the next 3 years. That they would be involved in setting up the initial scope of work, reviewing the invoices, and if there are issues between the local staff and the consultants, then they'd be there to try to smooth those over. But that the actual review of the documents, review of the work would be the job of the local staff. We would have our managers, our one or the other, at the meetings. They're required to be, someone from the authorities required to serve on the TAC for the studies. But that the work would be given to local staff to review and oversee and make comments on, and adjustments and changes and whatever.
So let's say, I don't know, just take any example here. You do a parking study. The work that entails is reviewed and approved by the local jurisdiction.
Yes.
It is their product. Is that correct?
Yes.
So the authority has no
editorial
or decision-making regarding the end product?
Not once we've all agreed on the scope.
Okay.
I mean, you will have submitted your basic idea, and we will have of what you want to do and what you want to have done. And we will work out a scope between you and the consultant and us. And then once that's worked out, then it's your baby. It's not our baby.
Okay. Paul? No, we're still at questions, and then we're going to ask the public for any comments. Any other questions? All right, anyone from the public who wishes to?
I'll do one more question,
Okay,
and then have some
please.
comments.
Okay.
As far as the review of the PDA planning grants, couldn't this group be that review body? I mean, they are the PDA planning grants. We are the PDA Working Group. We're made of a diverse group from across the county. We're used to being sort of in the PDA Working Group, TCC, Planning Commission, CCTA Board pipeline.
It's a little unwieldy. I mean, big groups tend to be a little more difficult.
So typically, how big is the review group for something like this? Maybe just to give a context.
Usually 4 or 5 plus authority staff. So I found that unless you get just really a ton of applications, that I have gone through the process where there was a very large, but not this large, group, and it was unwieldy. But they were looking at a whole lot more applications than we would be, I think.
Could it be a subgroup of this group, an ad hoc committee of this group that would then report to this group before it then goes on up the pipeline?
It is something that the TCC we've already given that role to, and that has traditionally been one of their roles is to come up with a subcommittee. It doesn't necessarily have to be TCC members, but that the TCC would appoint them. And there is some overlap.
Any other questions? Okay, hearing none, let me open it up to the floor behind me. Is there anyone in the audience who has a comment or a question? Please. Yes, if you could give your name and organization for the record first.
Yeah, Bradley Cleveland. I'm a planning consultant working with Urban Habitat. And sorry I didn't have a chance to go through all the material, but I don't see a reference to the CARE zones, the community air risk evaluation zones, and I was wondering if you could address that.
We didn't include it. That's the short answer. The CARE areas are kind of a double-edged sword in terms of PDA development. The PDAs are located in places where there is or will be transit and where there are job opportunities or opportunities for housing that would be higher density and close to transit and where you can create walkable communities. Those locations in Contra Costa and throughout the Bay Area and probably throughout the nation are in places that are often, not always, but often close to generators of air pollutants. The two big CARE areas in Contra Costa are in West County, mostly in Richmond, includes part of El Cerrito and San Pablo, and in Central County. And I think we are in a CARE area right now, if I remember correctly, at one of the corners of the CARE area that includes Monument Corridor and up to Concord Avenue and over to Contra Costa Boulevard. And we're in a PDA right now. So in terms of the PDA development and planning, we didn't include the CARE areas as a requirement or consideration.
Other questions or comments from the floor? All right, then we'll come back to the working group for comments. Paul?
Thank you. Two comments. One regarding the recommended planning element regarding environmental review on page C3. I would suggest that priority be given to planning grants that contemplate actually a specific plan EIR beyond just a program EIR. I think that is by far the most effective EIR streamlining tool, so I think that those should be favored. And second, and this is an issue that our organization has been very concerned about, seeing what has happened following adoption of Plan Bay Area, and again, I'll pick sort of on Marin, and that is, 4 or 5 PDAs have been withdrawn. Plans that were funded by MTC station area planning grants, quite a lot of money, were prepared, even EIRs completed, and then as soon as the neighbors got wind of the proposed higher density, all heck broke loose, and the jurisdiction mothballed the project and said, oh, we're not going to build these higher density units. We're going to stick by our general plan LOS policy on traffic. And so I'm concerned about beefing up the screening criteria number 4, which is the indication of support from the council or board. One of the great weaknesses of the PDA system as it currently exists is that the resolutions of support required to submit a PDA application by the city or county doesn't require any public notice, doesn't require an initial study under CEQA, doesn't require property owners within the PDA to be noticed or neighbors to be noticed. And I think that should be something that should be required so that the politicians don't get weak-kneed after getting all the planning money if their constituents really don't want this. So I think that at the very least, if the indication of support from the elected body should come by formal resolution after a notice public hearing, and there ought to be some sort of both property owner notification and neighborhood notification consistent with if a subdivision map is being approved or something like that, so that the politicians know before they go forward whether or not they're going to get an earful from the neighbors and they're going to cave, or whether there's going to be some interest and willingness to walk forward together with their constituents. Thanks.
Thank you. Other comments? Corey?
So I think the health concerns are, it's a difficult problem, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not something we shouldn't be working on. I'd suggest seeing in number 1 on C2, potentially having one of the examples be a health analysis where we look at the air quality concerns, and potentially be a place where the project could show project impact on page C4 under number 2 as a way to improve health outcomes. If a project could show that it could improve health outcomes, be that creating a walkable, bikeable place where people would get daily physical activity, or reducing or mitigating air quality concerns, I think a good application should get points for putting that down as a project impact. Back in page 31, there, in the last paragraph on page 31, there's talk about the PDA planning efforts, emphasizing or giving greater potential. Giving greater potential for giving priority for PDAs that have a greater potential for causing displacement. And I don't see that reflected in the selection criteria. I think that there should be, I'm not sure exactly how you would quantify that, but it seems like there should be some sort of selection criteria that if a PDA is particularly going to cause displacement, particularly of low-income individuals, that the PDA planning grant should be given priority for that.
Other comment? Oh, sorry.
Could I have a follow-up question on that? That could have unintended consequences. So if the city's plan is to have a bunch of new development that would displace, and you're going to give priority to a project that would do that displacement.
Yes, but theoretically, isn't preserving affordable housing part of the PDA plans?
Then that's what you want as the criterion. Will the project do that? Not whether the project would displace it. Am I wrong there?
I don't know. I only sort of raised the issue. I don't know exactly what the criterion would look like.
Well, I think part of the comment is just that there should be consistency with this text on page 31 and the criteria. If you're not going to give preference then in Appendix C, then you probably would change the text on page 31.
But I would advocate for not changing the text on page 31. The parts in the criteria under number 3 seem pretty varying and wide-ranging, and they get kind of jumbled. And I'm wondering if they would be there would be value in separating them out just so you can see each of the different things that are talked about here. I mean, there's everything from parking policies to transit-oriented development zoning, going into then existing citywide affordable housing policies, approved projects. It's a lot of a jumble of different kinds of policies. And are they getting scored on each of these individual, or there's, I'm not sure how this would sort of actually work when you're reviewing an application.
I'm not tracking where you are. I'm sorry, maybe Brad is. What number are you on, or what page?
Sorry, I'm on C4, number 3.
Oh, okay. Well, like I mentioned earlier, or as I mentioned earlier, that we're not taking the quantitative approach that we took on with the OBAG funding. That what we could I can reorganize those and have them as a bulleted list, maybe a little clearer, and maybe that would they would all be things that the committee that will review these applications that come in under the planning grant program, they will have to consider all of these and in their professional judgment come up with which ones deserve the 15 points and which ones deserve 12, or and it'll be subject to discussion among the committee members as well.
And I guess ultimately it's about increased housing? And
No,
the
it's not
policies?
No, not
that,
necessarily. I mean, the ultimate reason for this planning grant program in the first place is to get the PDAs developed. And housing's part of it, transportation is part of it. I mean, this is transportation planning fund after all, so there has to be some link to transportation improvements in the area. Affordable housing is just one component of it. Commercial, I mean, it could be an employment center as well. Those are also, there will be no housing. There will be no, we only have 2 of those in the county, Rumrill and Oakley. But, that criteria, set of criteria that relate to housing wouldn't really apply there.
Other comments? Yes, LD.
In terms of infrastructure needs, how are you looking at, if, for example, if you know you have an infrastructure capacity issue, but it's not transportation related, say it's wastewater, it's water, it's something that's not roads or transit, how are you looking at that? It's still a constraint to development in the PDA, but it may not be transportation related.
Here's how we hope to get around this. Because we know that not every constraint is transportation related, that's one of the reasons why we want to look at these applications as a whole, and the planning for it as a whole, because the planning for every PDA is going to have to involve transportation in some form, whether it's redesign of the intersection of Cutting and San Pablo, which I know is a concern in El Cerrito, or increased transit service or access to a BART station, redesign of streets for complete streets, to create complete streets within the community, within the PDA. So we would look at the other infrastructure, whether it's sewer, water, or power, communications facilities, all of those things as part of this larger planning effort that involves transportation. And certainly, if you look at what's going on, say, in the west, Walnut Creek downtown specific plan, they are considering all of those infrastructure needs, even though the funding is service transportation. Thanks.
Other comments? All right, I think that brings us near the end of our agenda. Brad, do you want to just review again the next steps? I think you went over them before, but maybe it's good to go over the dates and steps again.
Yes, thanks. So today's Tuesday, March the 11th, my sister's birthday, and the PDA Working Group. Your comments and the changes that you've suggested, we'll send them to the TCC. They will meet on March the 20th, and they will discuss the PDA strategy and the planning grant program. On April 2nd, the planning committee will meet to discuss it. On April 16th, the authority will meet to adopt a PDA strategy and the PDA planning grant program. And as soon as we can, we will send out that call for projects for the to all of you and your brethren, I guess. I hope that's not a sexist term.
Might be.
It could be.
Sistren?
Okay. Sistren? Brethren and sistren? That will give local jurisdictions staff 2 months to get in your applications, and we're hoping to get the applications approved by the authority in September.
And I know in the interim we have handed out the offending pages, so you should have copies of those. Apologies that those came the way they did. I imagine if you send an email, you can get an electronic version as well if you want that, but you have paper versions now of those pages.
We will try to figure out why mine looks great and yours doesn't, so that we can avoid the embarrassment that I have to feel this afternoon. It's not a fancy font. That's the...
Thank you all for your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
we're always happy to do like, especially with projects like that.
Or no, I'm sorry, or like a maximum density up to X number of units. And they were okay with us like doing that and using that. Oh,
thank you. Now, if I can just answer your question, we're finished.
I know.
Sorry, I'm sitting there going like, we're debating your head in some way.
It's really difficult, especially if we're trying to do it.
So they're interested in proposing a conceptual study of that.
As a follow-up.
But so,
Well, they can't, they're, and they believe that they can't, because you have to win it back. They can't. Yeah, yeah, you got more or less, they come up with side end, a lot of it, we don't have error.
that project does qualify. Even though it's not a goal specific plan, it's implementing something else that is.
Okay,
As long as they could show.
Hey, yeah,
More feasible, that would be a
like
qualified
at the state level,
project.
I mean, you think about it, now, there's a basic decision that is incorporated into your general plan, that you're going to have the cost of doing it. And then, how do you get there? What are the planning exception? It could be you need to use some basic market study, other environmental studies, then that information. Well, that's right. You know, I've seen a lot of these programs around the state where they implement it and then they're forgetting about it.
But in Lafayette's case, it sounds like a lot of that
So
hypothesis
this is
here, but
this
it's
is
not actually all done.
yeah.
And now they need to just do some more detailed tunnel study.
Like I've gone back and
Because I think, I'm not sure that really comes out in Appendix C. I think Appendix C sort of implies that you should be proposing to do a whole specific company. So I think that to the extent you're willing, and I think you should look at these more commercial projects. I think that's one of the beauties of the fact that this is.
I tried to make that clear, and that's not NPC's pattern. Basically took its program, and they want the whole thing.
Exactly, they want the whole thing.
So
So we'll be in